Everyone likes a good race in the wet, except possibly FIA and race control. But anyway, we like to see drivers tested in difficult conditions. So here is the list of the top 10 wet weather drives in F1 history.
Gentlemen, a short view back to the past.
Number 10, Damon Hill, 1994 Japanese Grand Prix. Now Hill picks this out as his greatest drive, and it's easy to see why. The championship pressure was really on coming to Suzuka. He really needed to beat Michael Schumacher to have a chance going to the Adelaide finale, and the conditions were terrible. Schumacher and Hill pulled away from the rest of the pack rapidly either side of a safety car for various offs and excursions, but when Martin Brundle crashed and hit a marshal, they actually flew the red flags, and the race would be decided on aggregate, which was a key point and something I wish F1 had not got rid of. After the restart, Schumacher took the lead, but he was on a two-stop strategy to Hill's one. That meant that Hill had track position and Schumacher had to come back at him in the closing stages. Now Hill was on older rubber, and in fact one of his rear corners was very old because they'd not been able to change it at the pit stop, something that Williams decided not to tell Damon at that point. With one lap to go and under intense pressure, Hill had a 2.5 second lead on aggregate as Schumacher charged after him, but Hill actually managed to extend the lead on the final lap to take a famous victory and of course take the title fight down to the somewhat controversial Adelaide finale. Number 9, Keke Rosberg, 1983 Monaco Grand Prix. The Cosworth DFV had very much had its day by the early 1980s, and by 1983 turbo power was very much the thing to have, and it was really only street tracks that gave the Cosworth runners a chance. The 1983 Monaco Grand Prix was wet from the start, but Rosberg and his Williams teammate Jacques Laffite started on slick tyres. Could they keep it going before the track dried? Well, they did rather better than that. Rosberg stormed into the lead on the very first lap. He was 1.7 seconds clear of Alain Prost at the end of that first lap, and Prost was 9 seconds clear of the third driver. Predictably, as the track dried and everyone else peeled into the pits, Rosberg was left with an enormous lead. And when Laffite dropped out, his lead looked even better, except for the fact that he was suffering from an engine misfire. He also had a virus infection and blistered hands, and this, remember, on a track that required more gear changes than anywhere else. But he held on courageously to win by 18.5 seconds. So it was really a win of tenaciousness and incredible car control. Number 8, Sebastian Vettel, 2008 Italian Grand Prix. It might seem a bit harsh to pick Vettel's first win as his best one, but I really do think it stands up there as his best. Remember, he was driving for Toro Rosso, the ex-Minardi squad that had never won a Grand Prix. In fact, at this point, neither had the Red Bull main team either. Vettel starred in a wet qualifying session to take pole ahead of Heikki Kovalainen's McLaren, but there was a bit of an assumption that perhaps the faster cars would come through on race day. But not a bit of it. Vettel always looked in command, except that was when Lewis Hamilton's charging McLaren up from 15th on the grid appeared in his mirrors. Vettel had already stopped, Hamilton hadn't, and when Hamilton did peel in, he went for another set of extreme wets as McLaren believed the rain was going to worsen. This was crucial because if he was right, he wouldn't need another pit stop and overcome Vettel. As it happened, the rain didn't come back and Vettel was able to stay out on his tyres. Hamilton had to pick again and Seb took a famous victory for the Minnow squad. Number 7, Graham Hill, the 1962 German Grand Prix. I think this is something of a forgotten gem on the fearsome Nordschleife. Hill had a pretty difficult weekend as well because in practice a camera had come off another car and caused him to go off at 140 miles an hour. He somehow escaped unscathed from the ensuing accident, but it did put him in the spare and older BRM P57 for the race. Conditions were so bad on race day there was actually a landslide and the race was delayed. At the start, pole sitter Dan Gurney's Porsche took the lead, but Hill soon came through in front and he was chased by Gurney and John Surtees in a Lola. Hill had to contend with a loose fire extinguisher in the cockpit and pressure from two of the world's best drivers behind him for the entire distance. But he held firm, and when Surtees was balked on his last challenge on the final lap, it was Hill that came through to take what he regarded as one of his finest victories. Just 4.4 seconds covered the top three, and this I put second in Graham Hill's best drives of all time in a list I did a couple of years ago, beaten only by his heroic 1965 Monaco race. Number 6, Jean-Pierre Beltoise, 1972 Monaco Grand Prix. Now this made our one-hit wonders list as well, because I think it's a truly remarkable drive by someone who never won another World Championship race. Beltoise qualified the BRM P160B, which was not particularly competitive in 1972, it barely scored points anywhere else, but he qualified it 4th in the dry and then made an incredible start to burst through into the lead right from the off. When the Ferrari of Clay Regazzoni and the Lotus of Emerson Fittipaldi made errors and allowed Jackie Ickx, an acknowledged Rainmeister already, up into second place, some people felt that that was it and he'd close on Beltoise. Certainly the way the gap had ballooned early on stopped, but Ickx never looked like catching the BRM. Despite a wild moment at Portier at one stage and some quite major risk taken in traffic, Beltoise came through to win by 38 seconds over Ickx. Everyone else was lap, and Beltoise's best lap was 0.6 seconds faster than anyone else. A truly remarkable performance. Number 5, Lewis Hamilton, 2008 British Grand Prix. And most great drivers have a brilliant wet weather performance somewhere on the CV, and Hamilton has several, but for me this one is the one that I think people will remember when he finishes his illustrious career. Hamilton struggled a little bit in the dry with his McLaren and could only qualify 4th, but made a brilliant start in the wet to challenge his teammate Heikki Kovalainen for the lead at Copse. In fact, they just about touched. He chased Kovalainen for a few laps before moving through into the lead, and despite struggling with a misty visor, pulled clear, apart from one challenger who came out of the pack, and that was Kimi Räikkönen in his Ferrari. The two leaders came in together, and this is where a crucial moment happened. Ferrari decides to leave Räikkönen on the old Inters, McLaren put new Inters on to Hamilton's car. As they came out of the pits, the rain returned, and that was crucial because the new Inters on Hamilton's McLaren were much more effective, and he disappeared down the road, never to be seen by any other driver until the end of the race. Well, apart from when he was lapping them, of course. As an aside, there wasn't a point in this race where extreme wets were the tyre to have, and Hamilton was on intermediate, so he was about 3 seconds a lap slower than the quickest people on extreme wets, but he was also several seconds a lap quicker than anyone else on the equivalent tyre. And because he stayed out, he ended up with an enormous lead. He won by over a minute from Nick Heidfeld in second place, a frankly ridiculous winning margin in modern F1. Some very experienced F1 drivers also made quite a few mistakes that day, and I believe Felipe Massa managed 5 spins trying to keep up with Hamilton in that particular race. Number 4, Jim Clark, 1963 Belgian Grand Prix. Now Clark has several candidates for this list, but I've gone for this one where he managed to win by about 5 minutes on a track that he actually didn't like very much at all. He thought, probably quite rightly, that it was too dangerous. He'd also struggled in qualifying. He was usually on pole position with his Lotus 25 and Lotus 33 during the 1500cc era, but he only qualified 8th for the Belgian Grand Prix. But if we were making a list of the greatest F1 starts, this would probably be on it, because he was in the lead before he reached Eau Rouge. Now, in those days, the start line was between the Source and Eau Rouge, so to go from 8th to 1st, even on the old 3-2-3 grids, must have been something to see. Now, Graham Hill's BRM did sort of keep up with Clark in the early stages, although he still had an 8-second lead after 5 laps. When the BRM failed, however, Clark's lead ballooned to more than a minute and a half. The heavens then opened completely, and lap times went from 4 minutes to 6 minutes. Even Lotus boss Colin Chapman and BRM manager Tony Rudd tried to get the race stopped, but of course this is the 1960s and they carried on regardless. At one stage, Clark lapped the second place Cooper of Bruce McLaren, but backed off in the closing stages as he only won by 4 minutes and 54 seconds. Number 3, Mark Schumacher, 1996 Spanish Grand Prix. Now Schumacher's another driver who could have had several entries on this list. In fact, you could probably say that about any of the top 5 or 6 drivers here. But this one is key for several reasons. One is, of course, that it's his very first victory for Ferrari. Remember, when Schumacher joined as a double world champion for Benetton, Ferrari was not in a great state. And the F310 wasn't a very good car either. In the dry, he was 1.1 seconds off pole sitter Damon Hill's Williams. He also made a terrible start in the appalling conditions, and despite the fact he actually gained ground during that first lap, still came through only in 6th place. Thereafter, he was on a completely different level to anyone else, quickly chasing down the front runners, which were Jean Alesi in the Benetton and leader Jacques Villeneuve in the Williams. On lap 12, he took the lead, and just 2.5 laps later, he was 10 seconds clear. Schumacher never lost the lead during his 2 pit stops, and he won by 45 seconds despite the fact that his V10 was actually a sort of a V8 or a V9 at various points during the course of the second half of the race. More than any other driver, Schumacher experimented with different wide lines on that day, and it was a truly remarkable performance that underlined his ability on a day when more than half the field crashed or spun off. Number 2, Ayrton Senna, 1985 Portuguese Grand Prix. No, I know what you're going to say, Donington, blah, 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 brilliant. But actually, even Senna thought that this race was better, and I will tell you why I agree with him. First of all, he had far less experience in 1985 than he had in 1993. Second of all, he didn't have traction control that he would have later on. And thirdly, the Lotus Renault, which was of course during the turbo era, would I think be classed as a much more tricky car to drive. So for me, and this, remember, is also his first Grand Prix victory, pips Donington 1993. I know that you'll think I'm wrong because when we did a social media vote on this a couple of years ago, Donington won by miles, but I'm sticking with Estoril 85. From his first F1 pole position, Senna led in appalling conditions from the start and was 2.7 seconds clear of teammate Elio De Angelis at the end of the first lap. The two Lotuses actually initially pulled away from the field before Alain Prost's McLaren came through to take second place. Just before half distance, the rain got so bad that even Senna, who is now 37 seconds clear, was waving to try and get the race stopped. But again, we're not in the current era, so the race continued, and Prost actually underlined how wet it was by aquaplaning off in a straight line going past the start-finish line. Only 9 of the 26 starters were classified at the end, and Senna won by over a minute from Michele Alboretto's Ferrari. Bear in mind that Senna was in just his second F1 season, his first in a front-running car, and this was very early on in that 1985 campaign, so this was very much a statement of intent and an indication of what was to come in the following years. Number 1, Jackie Stewart, 1968 German Grand Prix. Now, to beat Senna and Schumacher on this list, it was always going to take something pretty remarkable, and I reckon Stewart's domination of this event in appalling conditions on what I believe is the greatest racing circuit of all time is the thing that gets ahead of those two great drivers. Yes, he had a tyre advantage that day, and of course the Amatra MS10 was one of the better cars of 1968, but Stewart had quite a few challenges to overcome that day, and his level of domination was frankly ridiculous. Now, Stewart lined up on row 3 after a rather disappointing practice session, but used his brain almost immediately by identifying that there was more grip on the concrete pit lane to the right-hand side of the start-finish line, which was open, there was no barriers in those days, and simply drove onto that to get more traction and move up into third place. He then quickly overcame Chris Amon's Ferrari and the Lotus of Graham Hill to lead by 8 seconds at the end of the first lap. 14.2 miles later, which was 1 lap, he added 25 seconds to that margin. 25 seconds, 1 lap. So he's half a minute clear after 2 laps. On lap 8, Stewart set a time of 9 minutes and 36 seconds. The reason I'm telling you this is that that's 15 seconds faster than anyone else had managed up to that point, or indeed for the rest of the race. And I suspect, although I need to check, that's probably the biggest margin for a fastest lap in World Championship history. All you stats boffins out there can go and have that check and put them in the comments and tell me if I'm wrong. I challenge you to find a bigger one. Now, in the closing stages, second placed Hill, who'd been going great guns compared to everyone else in the Lotus, actually spun and stalled, and that ballooned Stewart's margin even further, and he crossed the line just over 4 minutes clear of everyone else. In fact, it was such a big margin, he was actually on the victory rostrum before Graham Hill finished the race. But the story isn't done yet, because Stewart had managed to achieve all this with a broken scaphoid in his right hand thanks to an accident at Jarama early in the year, and he has said that if it had been a dry race, he probably wouldn't have been able to win. So, one of the greatest drivers of all time on one of the finest, probably the finest, race circuits of all time in appalling conditions while injured. I think this one is a pretty strong choice for number 1, but let me know what you think in the comments. What order would you have? Are there any ones that I've missed completely that should be in the list? Give us a little nod in the comments on those. And please do click the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed this video. Also take a look at Motorsport TV for some great motorsport videos.